All right, so we're going to talk about some different ways to reference workbooks in VBA. So I have an example macro here that has a bunch of different ways to reference workbooks. I'm just going to walk through each of these. So the first one is just call it by the active workbook. Active workbook is basically going to reference the workbook that the user currently has active or that they're working with. So I'm just going to move the VB editor window over here so you can see some workbooks in the background. So right now, book 1 is my active workbook. So I'm going to use the debug.print method, and basically you'll see this line of code a lot. Debug.print is just going to print out whatever the line of code here returns, and it's going to print it out in the immediate window down here. So if you don't have the immediate window, press Control-G on the keyboard, and when we run this line of code, we're just going to get the result of this line here, activeworkbook.name, printed out down here. So I'm going to hit F8 on the keyboard. That's going to step us into our macro here, F8 again, and then F8 one more time, and you'll see that's printed out the active workbook name, book 1, which is this one here, book 1, in the immediate window down here. You'll also notice these lines of code, or I'm sorry, these lines of text here. These are actually comments, these lines in green. Let me make this a little bigger so you can see it. So these lines here all start with the apostrophe, and that basically comments out that line. So VB will not run this line of code. When the macro is running, it's just going to skip over this, and you can use these lines for comments to describe your code. So just wanted to mention that real quick. You just start the line with an apostrophe, and then you can type whatever you want here, and once you hit enter or the down arrow, it'll turn the line green because it starts with an apostrophe. All right, so let's move on. The next one is the this workbook. So this workbook would be different than the active workbook. When we reference this workbook, this is the workbook that the code module is actually in. So if I'm going to put the properties window, or I'm sorry, the project window back up here. So this workbook that we're working in this code module right here, and that is in the My First Macro workbook. So that's different than the active workbook. So if I hit F8 now, you'll see down here it's printed out the My First Macro is basically this workbook. So that's another way to reference workbooks. Another way to reference the workbooks is with the workbooks property, and basically there's a collection of workbooks here. So within Excel, the collection of workbooks are all the workbooks that you have open right now on the computer, and you can then reference the workbook by its name. So we can just put the name of the workbook in quotes here and then reference it, and then in this case, this method to activate will just activate that workbook. So if I run this line of code, that's just going to activate book 1 again. And another way to reference the workbooks is by their index number. So this is the index number here. Again, we're using the workbooks property, but instead we're specifying the index number. So if I rewrite this line down here, you'll see when I type workbooks and then open the parentheses, it's asking for an index number. And again, you can either specify a number or the actual name of the workbook here. So this would be the number of the workbook in the order that the workbooks were opened. So I'm just going to delete this. And if I run this line of code here, so I'm going to run this line here and hit F8, and you'll see now that it's listed my personal macro workbook. So that's the first workbook that Excel opened. Basically, when Excel opened for the first time, it opens this file in the background. And so that would be the first workbook that was opened. So that would be workbook number 1. Now, like I said, the workbooks are basically a collection of workbooks. So you can run this line of code here, workbooks.count, and that will count the number of workbooks that are currently open. So as you can see, as I hover over that, it returns the number 3 there. Basically, that means I have 3 workbooks open. It would be these 2 over here, my first macro, book 1, and then my personal macro workbook here. It doesn't count any add-in files. So I also have the PivotPal add-in file open here. You can see that, but it's not counting that as an open workbook because we're not actually interacting with that file. So if I run this line here, again, that's just going to output the number, which is 3. So that's our total number of workbooks open right now. And then I also just wanted to mention that again, this index number here has to be within basically the number of open workbooks. So this index number would have to be within 1 and 3 because that's our total number of open workbooks. So if you put the number 4 here, that's going to return an error because there's no workbook number 4 in our collection of workbooks. So if I hit F8 now, you'll see that returns an error subscript out of range, and then we can hit debug, and that's going to take us back to this line of code. So in future videos, we'll talk about how to loop through the workbooks collection and set variables to the workbook names and all that stuff. But this should hopefully just give you an overview of how you can reference workbooks within your code in VBA.